Good evening, everyone. My name is Aprile Gallant. I'm the Associate Director of Curatorial Affairs and the Senior Curator of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs at the Smith College Museum of Art. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the final program connected with SCMA's exhibition, Defiant Vision, Prints and Poetry by Munio Makuuchi. By way of beginning, I would like to acknowledge that the space in which we gather today is built within the ancestral homelands of the Nunatak peoples. I would also like to recognize our present-day neighboring indigenous nations, the Nipmuc and the Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan, Pequot, and Narragansett to the south, the Mohican and Mohawk to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. Finally, I would like to acknowledge and celebrate the presence of indigenous people among us today. I begin with this acknowledgement because recognizing the United States as a settler colony is essential to understanding this country's past and present, which makes it essential to telling the story of Munio Makuuchi. Makuuchi was an American artist of Japanese descent whose life and career were deeply affected by the removal of his family from the West Coast during World War II. Although this event had significant ripple effects throughout his lifetime, one clear outcome was his dogged refusal to bow to outside pressures. Indeed, Makuuchi's defiance was both a blessing and a curse. It drove his productive career as an artist and poet, but also limited recognition of his work during his lifetime. I first heard of Makuuchi's work in 2007 when Floyd Cheung, professor of English and American Studies at Smith, emailed me concerning a manuscript he had recently acquired for the Smith College Special Collections. His message was something along the lines of, I'm really interested in this guy's poetry, and he also made prints. What do you think of the prints, and do you think they have a place in the SCMA collection? When I saw the prints, I was actually amazed. Not only were they technically accomplished, the works were also rich and layered with nuanced narratives. I was eager to know more and surprised that I had never heard of the artist. Repeated digging did not reveal much more, but on the strength of the work, SCMA acquired its first print. This put me in touch with the artist's son, Jamie, who I'm pleased to say is with us this evening. 5 years later, we acquired 15 more prints, some of which were donated by Jamie and his family. Based on the fact that SCMA was now the largest institutional collection of Munio Makuuchi's work, as well as a decade of scholarship by Floyd and his students, we decided it was time to introduce Makuuchi to our community and reintroduce him to the world. Key among my curiosities on Makuuchi was not only the details of his life and the development of and relationship between his prints and poetry, but the central question of why he was not better known during his lifetime, which, as in many cases, has absolutely nothing to do with quality. I also believe that Makuuchi's work has much to say to a contemporary audience, and I was eager to share it with our visitors. Tonight, we've assembled a panel of experts to speak on distinct aspects of Makuuchi's work. Each will present a short talk, followed by discussion among us, and then we're excited to hear and address your questions. Without further ado, I will introduce our panelists in the order in which they will speak. Andrew Balkin, who is to my right, is an artist, master printer, publisher, and the founder and director of AGB Graphics Workshop in Madison, Wisconsin. Most recently, he has been focusing on his own art, intimate and refined geometric constructions, which he recently showed in New York. He received a BA, MA, and MFA from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he met Munio Makuuchi in 1973. The two artists remained lifelong friends. Floyd Cheung, in the middle, is professor of English Language and Literature and American Studies and the founding chair of the 5-college Asian Pacific American Studies Certificate Program. His scholarship focuses on the interpretation and recovery of early Asian American texts, and he has edited multiple volumes by and about forgotten and lesser-known authors. In 2012, he was awarded Smith's Sherrod Prize for Distinguished Teaching. From 2014 to 2019, Cheung served as the director of the Sherrod Center for Teaching and Learning. He currently serves as vice president of the Office of Equity and Inclusion. Born in Hong Kong, Cheung grew up in Las Vegas. He's also a published poet. Margo Machida, who is at the end, is Professor Emerita of Art History and Asian American Studies at the University of Connecticut. Born and raised in Hawaii, She is a scholar, independent curator, and cultural critic specializing in Asian American art and visual culture. She has lectured widely on her research, both nationally and internationally, and served as a curatorial advisor for the inaugural 2017 Honolulu Biennial. Her book, Unsettled Visions, Contemporary Asian American Artists and the Social Imaginary, Duke University Press, 2009, received the Cultural Studies Book Award from the Association for Asian American Studies. She is an associate editor of the international journal Asian Diasporic Visual Cultures in the Americas and co-editor of the spring 2017 special issue, Island Worlds, Oceanic Diasporas and Global Flows. Machida is a co-founder of the Diasporic Asian Art Network, 2008, and Godzilla, Asian American Art Network, 1990 to 2001. In 2009, she received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Women's Caucus for the Arts. So without further ado, I will give you Andy Balkin.
Thank you, April. First of all, I want to thank Aprile Gallant and Floyd Cheung and Smith College Museum of Art, who have put this enormous energy, time, and expense into making Defiant Vision prints and poetry by Munio Makuuchi a reality. Indeed, it's very special. Let me cut right to the chase by asking this question. What does it mean to be defiant, particularly a defiant artist? Well, Munio answered this in how he lived with a very bold, intense, aggressive code of personal and social resistance to the forces that would have otherwise shaped his life in far more conventional ways. He would not be submissive, as I witnessed often, and he was neither accepted in Asian circles necessarily, nor accepted in Caucasian circles. But this did not diminish his bravado that he extended throughout his interactions. How did this manifest itself in his personal life? In the American internment camp in Idaho, he created paper airplanes in the shape of animals, which he flung over the camp's barbed wire fences. Later, he would coin them origami. This disobedient act provided him a sense of not only creative joy while making them, but it also later in life, with a smile, he talked about flying those planes over the camp as if he was aboard those planes. They gave him a sense of freedom and empowerment. This defiance to his imprisonment gave him a basic existential freedom, which in turn ignited his early creative and sensitive and artistic sensibilities. Munio, despite his life circumstances, was always be defiant, willful, and very joyful at the same time. Like Walt Whitman in The Song of Myself, Munio celebrated himself, and he overcame the shadows of grief and suffering in the camps that surrounded him. In the controversial politics of the universities he participated in as a student and teacher, and the social and perhaps potentially dangerous upheavals circling him in Africa where he taught, Munio had a twinkle, a life force that allowed him to witness but not get totally embroiled. Munio's defiance fed his muse, and his muse reflected his lifelong exploration of the natural, cosmological, and metaphysical mysteries, perhaps not to solve them, but to expose them in his heightened poetic and artistic works. Munio enjoyed being social. He was really a social animal. First impressions of others were important to him. His senses were always on fire. He always had his antennas out. Munio was unfettered and really a true Dionysian. With his prints lining the wall at a one-person show at Edgewood College in Madison, I remember seeing this. Munio had a group of women in colorful costumes dancing around him as he recited his poetry. I know they made a circle, and Munio was right in the middle of it. It was pure pageantry that filled the senses, pure Dionysian joy, without drugs and without alcohol. It was really quite wonderful. The women had gorgeous, beautiful, flowing dresses. Munio provided mystery, which did feed his muse. Munio's deep sensuality was provocative in life as it was in his art. His relationships were intense, and I must say, oftentimes difficult. I experienced them myself. A constant source of joy, though, that would ignite his art. Munio, much like Picasso, found himself at times in very stormy relationships. With friends, he would come and go while poking at us, demanding us to engage with him, which stirred his creative energies. Family, obviously, was very important to him, as evidenced in the numerous family portraits that were elaborate and most depicting his very visceral feelings he had towards those he drew. This show is evidence that, and it's important, this show is evidence that history happens sometimes behind our backs. Let me say about this, about my best friend Munio, I am glad that now he is getting the attention he so deserved. Munio was an exceptionally intuitive and creative person. He would talk late into the night about how he could expose the veil of life's mysteries. Munio's artwork was a composite of extremes. His images through line were sometimes heavy and prudish, but they also could be extremely delicate and quite sensual. Munio's life was a composite of extremes, just as he had been imprisoned as a young boy facing the horrors of the camps. He chose to be emotionally free to create those planes that soared above the tragedy he has faced. His art reflects audacity and beauty that viscerally impacts his audience. Munio's art dares us to feel. I'm going to quote Aldous Huxley, "Poets purify the dialect of the tribes." And I will end by reading this poem, The Restitution. The restitution of the Constitution re-stimulated my childhood memories. POW, 7 to 11 years old. And so, with middle perception, returned with prose, poems, drawings, aquaphor drawings, yet hoping not to wimp and limp into your consciousness or crutches of self-pity, but to emphatically shade experience as a sacred act in itself. For are not most of us prisoners of our own skins, yearning to be free?
Thank you, Andrew. Is the microphone on? Other. Thank you, Andrew, for gracing us with that talk and that reading. This is the first day I've ever met you, and I feel like this is a long time coming. Thank you for coming. Thank you for all of the guests and all of the people who decided to come out tonight. I feel like I've been living with this work for, since 2005 or so, right? But I never knew Munio Makuuchi. I've only known him through his work, so to know him through your words and your memory of him and your friendship is a real contribution. Thank you. Also, I love the Walt Whitman connection. I think that works. Okay, so I need to acknowledge some collaboration as well, and I know that I'm going to miss some people, but I'll just say that first of all, the museum, right? April as my partner in crime. And the curator of prints and photographs at Smith College. Couldn't have done it without you. All the educators, all the installers, all the guards, so on. Students. So I think I've been working on this maybe since 2005 or 6, and I've had 9 student researchers over those years who have made major contributions, from helping me edit the poems to working on the chronology, to interviewing family members and writing up oral histories. And of course, also to Jamie, who's in the second row there. Couldn't have gotten this far without your generosity and your consultation, so thank you. The first collaborator, though, I think I need to mention, though, is named Fred Ho. I don't know how many of you out there know Fred Ho. He is an important Asian American musician and activist. In 2005, I was at a conference in Hartford for the American Studies Association, and Fred Ho was there in his giant gold robe, right? And he floated over to me, and he said, "Are you Floyd Cheung?" Right? And he's way more famous than I am, But by 2005 or so, I had published a couple little pieces about my interest in recovering lost writers and artists. And so Fred came over and he said, you know, if you're really serious about this, you can come to my place in Greenpoint, New York, and I have a closet full of papers, and I'll let you dig through them. So that next year, I went to Greenpoint, and I visited Fred's apartment, and he was really, really nice to me. I think we had some good food, and he let me go through his closet. And in the closet, oh, you see it. I found one of these, right? It's a 258-page typescript by Munio Makuuchi called From Lake Minidoka to Lake Mendota and Back to the Northwest Sea. And I knew from just hearing the title that there was something special there. I mean, that is quite a title. It has such rhythm in it. And it turns out there's a lot of humor in it as well, right? Because Lake Minidoka is like the ironic term for the for the cesspool at the internment camp, right? At the camp where Japanese Americans were rounded up and put in Idaho, as Andrew said. And that was Lake Minidoka, right? Lake Mendota refers to his time in the Midwest in Wisconsin, right? And then back to the Northwest Sea, right, is his ultimate return to the place from which he was displaced, this Northwest Sea of the Pacific Northwest in the Seattle area. So I just love that cycle. But in any case, I discovered this 256 or 258-page typescript in Fred Ho's closet, and he gave me permission to make some photocopies at the 7-Eleven down the road. Back when there were, I mean, I didn't have a cell phone. I mean, cell phones, at least I didn't have a cell phone. I couldn't take a picture of anything, so I had to make copies at the 7-Eleven. And then, I talked to our rare book room, and they were willing to take a copy if we could find one, and we could find one thanks to Jamie. And then April was good enough to help us begin to acquire some prints. Okay, so this book, it's my job to say a bit more about the poetry, though I love the Walt Whitman connection. I think that restitution is actually the best way to begin, right? Because that references the idea, I think, that it was about 1987-88, right, when the United States government actually came around to, after a long period and struggle of redress, to acknowledge its wrongs towards Japanese Americans during World War II. It was not a complete way of apologizing, but it was something. And the apology and I think it was $20,000 to each surviving member of the incarceration in 1988 was issued, a check of some compensation. And this seemed to, I think the word is re-stimulate, right? It re-stimulated some memories for Makuuchi, and then he started writing, and he just kept writing and writing and writing. It seems to me that among the many things that this book is about, I would say two of them are displacement and belonging, right? At least that's what I ended up deciding, for this particular talk. So I'll share one poem with you that's about displacement. Right, so that's the next slide. Okay, splitzoidal. Right. So Makuuchi loved making up words. So I'm sure this is one he made up. It sounds vaguely medical, as well as taking in the word split. So saying that there's something perhaps pathological that happened as a result of incarceration. Right. He writes, forced gathering of the tribe and the forced dispersal and diaspora, right? So Japanese Americans are spread throughout the West especially, right? Some in other places, some in Latin America, some in Canada, some in Hawaii, some in the East. But there's a forced gathering, mostly of those who are living on the West Coast, about 120,000, forced gathering of the tribe. And then after after the war ended in 1945, there was this kind of forced dispersal, right? Many people were actually a little bit afraid of leaving. They didn't know what they were going back to after the war had ended. A place that was willing to let them be rounded up would they be welcomed back to such a place? And so they were forced to disperse. Some people had to be actually forcibly removed from the camps. And then there was also this idea of maybe diaspora. The government actually tried to encourage Japanese Americans not to gather again into like Japantowns or little Tokyos, because the government argued that it was their coalescence as communities in the first place that made them not assimilate. Right? Of course, that's wrong. Right? They gathered because they needed community and language and solace. Right? That and many laws in the United States made it hard for them to live where they wanted to live. Right? So in any case, they tried to force a diaspora afterwards, and to some degree, they succeeded. Right? So I think part of the book is about all the kinds of displacements that happen. Right? And there are many more. For instance, he worked as a teacher in Nigeria later, which is not quite a displacement, but it was a different kind of location, and his art probably took a turn because of that experience. But in terms of belonging, I'll say, and this is the next poem, I think that for Makuuchi, he saw that art and poetry could create conditions for belonging, right? And reconnection. So this is a poem that's called Dreamings. Whether through feelings and hearing or seeing, so much psychic messages are seen through the visuals, whether of day or night dreams, or through the images, artists visualizing images in their expressions. In my entranced states of creative activities, there is a sense images are coming from somewhere else. Images from within meet on a 2D surface, from way out there or way in here. All right, I'll pause there for a second. I just love the ideas in this poem. That there's something way out there. Is it history? Is it other people's stories? Is it the unknown? Is it nature? And then way in here, his inner life, his memories, whatever memories were re-stimulated by the reconstitution of the Constitution, right? And that these find a way onto 2D surfaces, both prints and poetry. I think that that at some level the book was about gathering together all of those disparate tensions from the inner and the outer, the social and the personal, the mystical and the real. And I think also he thought that the poems might gather people that care, and you are among them tonight, so thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here with you. I mean, it's absolutely an honor. And it's so exciting to see this exhibition come together at last. Let me get this over here. So Munio Makuuchis, whoa, goodness. Wartime internment clearly had a profound impact on his life and art. Those were extraordinarily traumatic years for him and for fellow Japanese Americans. During which their sense of self and belonging to this nation and their faith in its institutions were severely eroded. Yet even amid forced relocation and incarceration, visual art provided a potent means of personal expression. As we can see with the artist Chiro Obata's very striking desert landscapes, and in Mineo Kubo's illustrated memoir, Citizen 13660, which is a very famous work that I'm sure many of you know. But as an adult, Makuuchi continually contended with the psychic imprint of this disruptive, very life-altering era through art and writings that mediate the troubled interface between personal and social trauma. And in this, there's a close kinship with the Seattle-born Roger Shimomura, another Japanese-American artist of the same generation, who, like Makuuchi, was also imprisoned as a child in Minidoka. This formative experience made Shimomura acutely aware of American xenophobia and the pernicious ways in which Asian Americans and other groups perceived as different from the majority culture can be readily subjected to racial stereotyping and discrimination, and even to mass incarceration. Since 1978, Shimomura had produced decades' worth of paintings and prints addressing the internment, beginning with his Minidoka series, and among them is the Diary series, based on poignant accounts drawn from his grandmother's wartime diary, which combines elements of pop art and traditional Japanese ukiyo-e woodblock prints to signify a symbolic encounter between cultures. In Different Citizens, Shimomura juxtaposes a somber self-portrait with a parodic wartime depiction of Hirohito, the Japanese emperor, in full military uniform. Besides providing a stark contrast between caricatured Asian stereotypes and actual individuals, this configuration suggests the easy interchangeability of such imagery, given how swiftly U.S. citizens of Asian heritage were recast as enemy aliens during wartime. Now, the disquieting reverberations of the internment continue to inspire new generations of Japanese American artists who seek to reconstruct elements of familial and collective past that still remains occluded to them. And among the contemporary artists pursuing this history are Wendy Murayama and Christine Aono. Murayama's 2012 installation, The Tag Project, is comprised of 10 densely bundled totemic columns of paper ID tags suspended from the ceiling. Working with volunteers from across the country, Murayama recreated thousands of the tags issued to internees departing for the camps, each bearing an individual's name, their destination, and their serial number. Such memorials to vernacular experience find a precursor in Makuuchi's etching from the late 1980s that the artist entitled A Beige Marble Tag Monument. Relics in Camp is a large-scale 1996 installation created by Aono for the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. Its centerpiece is a gallery-spanning platform sectioned into a recessed grid of shallow square chambers covered with a dense layer of glass over which viewers walked. Each compartment, labeled with the name of a different camp, contains soil collected from that site, along with commonplace objects that once belonged to their occupants, including her parents. For Aono, these battered relics give the stories of the camps a new reality. Hence, the expressive and aesthetic efforts of these artists confer tangible shape and form to social memory. Considered in a continuum along with the work of Munio Makuuchi, such imagery underscores the generative capacity of art practice to bring affectivity to our understanding of past events, especially to times that are shadowed by societal rupture, personal loss, and polarizing racial and ethnic enmity. Moreover, in the present atmosphere of blatant official antipathy that singles out certain minority groups, the themes and concerns behind this art unfortunately remain inescapably relevant. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for expressing your take on the various sides of Makuuchi's work. He certainly was a multi-talented artist. And that sort of leads me to one of the central questions that I'd love to have us discuss is, I have my own theories about why Makuuchi was not recognized during his lifetime, but I'm curious from your perspectives if you have anything to add about why you think he wasn't better known.
I think a lot of it has to do again with his defiant nature. He was so wrapped up in creating and sort of like peeking into what was happening, in the society around him, that it might have been very hard for him to see a future, of that type of recognition, because he was really cast out of a lot of what was happening in the art world, formerly.
And was that because he was primarily based in the Midwest and then went to Nigeria, or?
Well, I think he got a little bit more rounded, culturally when he went to Africa. But yes, primarily he was based in the Midwest, and I just think that had a lot to do with him not sort of like connecting to the larger, to the larger art world as such. He was really, I always call him kind of this backwater artist. He really enjoyed being that and celebrating it. And so he didn't really pay too much mind to, at that time when I knew him, of the bigger commercial world of art.
So did you think he didn't really want to participate in the larger art world?
In some ways, but I just think overall he just didn't seem all that concerned about it.
Shall I say a bit about living in the Midwest?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
I think that living in the Midwest did affect his literary reputation, right? For those of you who don't know, the Asian American movement didn't really get off the ground until after 1968. And it was in the early 70s that there was a movement to create an Asian American literary archive, right? And most of the people who were working on this were on the West Coast, right? A group that would come to be called CARP, or the Combined Asian American Resources Project, had at the time 3 Chinese American men on it. I think it was Frank Chin, Jeffrey Chan, and Sean Wong. And they all, they wrote mostly prose, and Frank Chin also wrote plays. And what they realized is they needed a Japanese American and they needed a poet, right? And they looked around, and they basically riffled through pictures, right, photographs, and they found Lawson Inada, right, who was living on the West Coast, and he was a Japanese American man who was a poet. And so they said, let's get Lawson. And they created the 4-person group to be the Combined Asian American Resources Project. Munio Makuuchi had no chance of being noticed because he just wasn't in the right place at the right time.
See how this thing works. Yep. I have to say that for me, my area of research is mostly contemporary, like post 90s. But my sense after looking at a lot of his work is that it didn't easily fit any particular category. It wasn't legible, and so I think that because of that, as compared to, for example, someone like Roger Shimomura, who was incredibly prolific, but also the work had a lot of points of entry, in the sense that, if you were aware of pop art, if you were aware of some of these conventions, that it was like graphic and bold, and so, yeah, so it was accessible. And I think that Munio's work slips the categories, and in that sense makes it harder for people to grasp a hold of something very readily. So I think that was like actually a piece of it. That knows how do you characterize this stuff. It looks like Redon. It looks like there are a lot of possible other associations. So I think that really created a kind of a problem. It's not marketable in that way.
You have to sort of remember though, his meeting up with Mauricio Lazansky. Lazansky was this Argentine artist who came up and basically started the first academic printmaking studio in the country at Iowa. But during World War II, William Stanley Hayter, who had the Atelier 17 in Paris, they left Paris and they came over to the States. Lazansky met Hayter, and at that point, abstract expressionism was starting to get in vogue. People like Pollock, people like, oh my gosh, de Kooning, a number of others would meet up with Hayter. And then again, there are these threads. There are these threads of surrealism. At the time, I remember Hayter early on. He was a chemist, but he was influenced, for instance, by Picasso. Picasso did all these, of course, portraits and all, but there was this thread of surrealism that was happening throughout Europe, and Lazansky and Meeting Hater saw that and kind of passed that along, and I think that Munio picked up a little bit of those threads that he didn't quite have when he was first doing drawings of the camps and all at Lazansky's studio. And that came more to the fore, I think, when he came to Wisconsin. He started delving into more metaphysical work. Less political, but just a bit more cosmological or metaphysical. It started to change.
Yeah, so that actually brings me to this sort of part two. So how does one reclaim an artist, a literary artist or a visual artist? You know, what is our responsibility for reclaiming artists that have been lost to history for any reason?
I'm not sure I can answer that, but I have to say that, some of the work that I've done, like my own research, has to do with exactly this type of artist. I've been looking at a number of artists who are Japanese Americans from Hawaii. Some of them are very well known at home, and not so much as soon as you get to the continental US. And I found that what's really critical is actually being able to work with families. So it doesn't answer the question of responsibility, but it does mean that it's a group effort. It means a long-term commitment. And that, I think, is, if not the responsibility, at least part of the method, because so much of this recovery, this type of work has to do with like going to people's houses, going to their attics, going to their basements, talking to anybody who knew them. Which is kind of, I know, part of your process too. And there's a recovery that's, very primary around this type of historical memory. So I would say that, in a way, it also means that the researcher has to be ready and open and willing to engage at that level. It's very different than conventional research, where, you're basically working with accessible. Even if you're doing archives, the archives are there, versus you have to create the archive first. So I would say that.
Yeah, I actually learned a great amount from just reading Makuuchi's transcripts from all of the many places that he went to school. It was just sort of chock full of information, which was a big surprise to me. But Floyd, your beat is rediscovering forgotten literary figures.
I know. I don't know how I got into this. Well, I actually do know. For some reason, I thought that it would be important to have a culture and a history if we're going to make the claim of belonging. And so having an archive is part of that, right? So I think and I've always been interested in the past. But your question is, what's our responsibility and how do we decide what gets recovered? One quotation comes to my mind from Carrie Nelson, who's a recoverer of 1930s proletarian literature. He says something like, we recover what we are psychologically prepared to recover, right? And I think I interpret that to mean that the audience of the moment has to be ready for whatever the politics and aesthetics of the work was that it might recover, right? So there's that. And a corollary to that is it's entirely possible to have people recovered and then forgotten again, right? But then thinking about it more personally, I think that some of it has to do with luck. What is it that you stumble into, and then what are you prepared in terms of your resources to recover, right? So I'm in an English department, so I look for things in English, right? I have a little French and a little German, but I have no Japanese and no Chinese, so it'd be hard for me to recover anything in a language I couldn't recover. And then I think luck also in terms of resources, right? You talked about expense, right? Recovering all this actually costs something, and then putting an exhibit on costs something. In travel for us and so on. So some of it is the luck of where the researcher is, right? We happen to be at Smith College. We happen to have all these riches right now that we could spend on this. I think somebody, was it you who said that we couldn't know, you can't imagine that this would have happened anywhere but Smith. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. Well, because I think certainly the fact that you were teaching with the material, and then also it's interesting that you bring that up. Like, where would we find a poet and someone who's obsessed with prints? I mean, it's tailor-made for Munio Makuuchi, so it was almost like it was meant to be.
It was partly luck and partly resources.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think that Munio Makuuchi's work has to say to a contemporary audience? I mean, people have asked me, they've asked me if because of the situation with people being incarcerated in the U.S. today, if this is something that we decided to do recently. But in fact, this has been in the planning for a very long time. But I'm just curious about what you all think that Munio's work has to say.
First of all, we see history being repeated and what's happening down along the Mexican border, people coming to this country being sort of like incarcerated. I mean, it's sort of like this whole cyclical thing of history being wound and then unwound again. And it certainly brings to the forefront what happened 70-some years ago and to some extent happening today. So I think that sort of brings the present and the past in focus to some degree.
You want me to give that a shot?
Sure.
Right? Meaning, I think following from that, I think there certainly is a thread of the past happening again, right? I've taught this class that's called Narratives of Internment. It's about the incarceration. I've teach it about every 3 or 4 years, and unfortunately, there's always something happening that it's in dialogue with in our contemporary U.S. history, right? In the case of Makuuchi's work, I would say that his concentration, especially on representing the vulnerable, I think is one echo with what's going on right now for a contemporary audience. Like, I'm thinking of the print with the small jackrabbit in the corner, right, of a barrack. And, there's an ominousness about it, and yet it focuses on the agency and vulnerability of this small character in the corner, right? That, for me, resonates with what's going on now, right? The other quick thing I'll say is, I don't know if you can see from the cover, but this image refers to a poem that's about how the speaker can see, I think it's called Shelters, as far as I could see, right? And it's as if it's from the outside of the fence looking in, right? But then there's another poem, another short poem, where Makuuchi's talking about how his vision is diamonded. That is, he's like always seeing through a fence, right? So I think that one of the other, for me, one of the other messages for a contemporary audience is to think about, what are the contemporary mind-forged manacles that we have, either that we've created internally or that have been imposed upon us by ideology or the government or the forces that are around us.
I guess, Floyd, just to build upon one of the things that you mentioned, is also, if you look at the span of the work that's in the show, and I hope everybody here has seen it, the other thing that's very powerful about Makuuchi's work is also the animal imagery. Like, people have mentioned this, but what's interesting is that, as a kind of a through line, he's not just looking at the threat to humankind, but a much larger vision of the living world, in which animals occupy at least as much space, in his psyche and in the body of work, and that really struck me very forcibly looking at the show, when you really see that. And so in that sense, it is very much part of the conversation of the last, 10, 15 years, where you're seeing a lot of people looking away from just, sort of anthropocentric views of the world, and seeing like a much larger global picture with all living things in the natural environment. And so I think that thematic, when people are, the sort of the ecological turn, the third turn away from just the human-centered, I think actually is quite powerful. And, you know, and in a way, his work sort of is a precedent for thinking about things that way. So that's something else. And I was thinking how interesting it would be to put his work directly in dialogue with some of these other people who are working in these lines. Because that's the other thing, is that it's not just what his work has to say, but then what kind of dialogue can you set up and recontextualize him so that he's understood within a continuum like that, you know, with you know, artists who are working now. So I think that's the other piece of it. We think about what else can be done, you know, is to think about how to contextualize them so we can bring out some of these other through lines that we started to look at.
Munio was kind of an internationalist too, of sorts. I remember at the UW, the dean of students, he had created a flag, and the flag had all of these rainbow colors on them. And he also was interested in the Olympic rings, how the rings sort of like were intertwined, and he loved that sort of a connection with sports, and particularly international sports and competition. So he had a certain outreach there to the world.
And also his mixed race thematic, you know, which you see in some of that. You know, you're talking about mixing of peoples and cultures. There's such a, you know, I mean, certain explicit in some of the pieces, you know, but that whole, I mean, the whole conversation about, you know, mixed race, mixed ancestry, which is so much, you know, it's like a very, very big subject right now, certainly in Asian American and Asian diasporic studies. So I just wanted to sort of mention that.
Yeah, so we could probably talk for much longer, but we really do want to hear your questions. And so Rowan is going to come down and get the microphone. And anyone who would like to ask a question. Okay. Oh. So please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question.
I don't have a question. I also happen to know Munio Makuuchi. And I think in your first question, why was Munio not accepted? Munio was a force. Munio had compassion, but he also was very passionate. And many people could not accept the passion, the force of his passion.
He was quite emotive in almost everything he did.
And he would not tolerate necessarily people who were politically correct and who knew how to play the political correct game, because he would just go out and say it the way it was. He was the poet, the clown, the drunk in literature, who could be in society and be a mirror to society and say, this is what is going on, or this is not what should be going on, and you should turn and change. And most people who were even his peers could not tolerate that. He was a very strong person. And a lot of times in history, in art history, those type of personalities would not be accepted during their lifetime. And they then just lived amongst themselves or amongst their friends or the people who they could relate to.
They were outliers of sorts, yeah.
I think I call him a prophet in the essay.
To some extent.
And prophets are rarely welcome.
People are frightened of them.
I guess this is a question for the curator of prints and photography. How much of his problem, or not a problem, but how much of the fact that he wasn't well known could have been attributed to the fact that he mostly worked in a medium that's kind of, you know, printmaking is a kind of smallish medium, and at the time, you know, when you go to museums, so many of the works of art are bombastic and on a grand scale.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. I certainly think that there is something to that. It was not only that he was a printmaker, but that he was making black and white prints at a time when most people were interested in, you know, multi-plate color, very slick, or as Margo mentioned, pop art, that, you know, he was aesthetically not doing things that people would necessarily have gravitated towards. And then also, we've mentioned the fact that his subjects were very complex, as was, his drawing style. So I think there's multiple reasons why. But I think certainly, I would contend that printmakers don't get the respect they should.
They should in some respects, because it's a very egalitarian sort of, activity. You make one copy, but you can edition, and those editions could be spread far and wide to, more people than just would have a painting or a sculpture.
Right, but unfortunately, Munio also, even though he was a printmaker, he never made regular editions. So he would pull a few proofs and then not make any more, which is quite unusual. So, but I do think there's something to his embracing of printmaking that led to his lack of recognition, sadly. Yeah.
So, Andy, I wanted to follow up on that, and there we go. And I was thinking about what Margo said about needing to build the archive, and I think we had this exhibition and we see this work and the study of it as a kind of a fact, a public fact now, but in fact, it does have this story of neglect for decades. And so it is kind of remarkable that the material was waiting there to be rediscovered. And
We had been a repository of these plates. He kind of said, Andy, take care of these plates. He knew that they were safe. I think had I not had them, a lot of them would have been lost along the way. There might have been a number of them that have. Sometimes I've gotten prints back, but I don't have the plates. In other words, some people have wanted to give the prints over to my archive. But I do have the majority of the plates, and it's really wonderful to have them and have them being part of this show.
could you say something about just printing with him? Any observations about his
Well, of course, I
process?
was around him a lot, and I saw the great creativity that he had. He was really quite spontaneous with his work. You'd give him a plate, and he would go right at it. It was really kind of magical. Very early on, he printed his own work, but then as years went by, I started to print editions and learned and became really sensitized to his aesthetic and how to print the plates. And so he said, Andy, you're my printer for life, you will. And so I learned a lot just from a printer's aspect of his work.
I'm just curious if you have any comment on the significance of his choosing a new name for himself.
Yeah,
Could we
so
answer
that is one of the many mysteries. So when he was born Howard Takahashi, and on his transcripts are great, for the University of Colorado, it says on December 7th, 1959, he officially changed his name to Munio Makuuchi. And Munio was his middle name, and Makuuchi was his mother's maiden name. And so there are many different theories as to why he did this. Some think that it was a reaction against his father, who was very domineering. There are just lots of different questions. So it's one of the many, many questions that I wish he was here so I could ask him, but I'm not really sure he would give me a straight answer from what I've read of Munio. So there really isn't any clarity on that.
So my question has to do with perhaps introducing another or other lenses through which to look at Munio Makuuchi's work. And I guess it's a question for anyone on the panel, perhaps to speak to sort of, he was schooled in kind of Euro-American Western artistic traditions in both the kind of artwork and the poetry, perhaps. And are there ways to look at kind of other lineages within those streams of thought that his work is in conversation with, or because I think to me, especially with when recovering artists, certainly there's the kind of biography, there's the kind of ethnicity, the kind of historical writ large context of the life experience that is kind of talked about a great deal. But I think too, it's part of the recovery is also seeing where it has these other kinds of reaches and touchstones. And so I just wanted to see if you had any thoughts about that.
I think one possible lineage would be beat poetry and also concrete poetry. These are, I think that some of the rhythms and the spontaneity, some of the kind of automatic, surreal work in the poetry especially, comes from a beat tradition. You think that's right? Okay, so I think that's one lineage, and that's in the essay. And then another one would be that there was a resurgence, especially internationally, in interest in concrete poetry in 60s, 70s, 80s, right? There are actually these beautiful, beautiful anthologies of international concrete poetry that are in the 5-college system, right? That I had for about 6 months. There's beautiful, beautiful books. And concrete poetry is the kind of poetry that uses the space of the page and the type itself in order to create visual and other kinds of other effects. And Makuuchi sometimes did that in his poetry as well.
In my own art, basically, it's more concrete. In other words, it's less to do with the world we see as much as the world that I intuit. And Munio certainly did intuit a lot of his work.
Yeah, no, I thought it was interesting what Margo said about how the first part of reclamation is letting people know about this artist, and the second is contextualizing. I think particularly with the dry points he was doing in the 80s, seems to fit very well into the neo-expressionist, when a lot of people were doing woodcuts and also doing a lot of dry point, because the German expressionists, those were the two modes of printmaking that they embraced. So I suspect that that's one of, I don't know if he was operating within that realm, but I certainly could see his work fitting very well in with those ideas.
I was going to also say that I think there's certain lines that you think about iconography. For example, the salmon motif that carries through. You can very easily think about that. Not just in relation to sort of the you can think about that in terms of Japanese art and some of those, but also how it connects him to other artists. I'm thinking about, in my essay in the catalog, I was writing about Tom Nakashima as one of those people, where the certain imagery, the fish imagery is very, very common in a lot of Japanese American work. But to be able to trace something like that, because it's like a whole visual discourse on itself. The way that plays back and forth between his associations with tradition, but also with the wild salmon. This idea of confinement and release. That was like the dynamic that you see.
There was a connection, I think, between the wild salmon swimming upstream, against all opposition, whether it be the water or whatnot. And I think that Munio also identified with nature that way.
Mm-hmm. But it is something, it's a through line, again, one of these things that would connect him, and also a number of other artists who are kind of working with those kinds of motifs. That would be really kind of fascinating to look at, to see how they're recasting it. As I said, when I mentioned Nakashima, and the idea of being in a cage, the fish, not sure, should it be swimming towards this institutional structure? Should it be fleeing from it? Should it be resisting? The tensions that are there that I think a lot of people are working with. So, again, that would be something to recast, in those terms, and then bring in other artists who are working with this.
I'm going to look at landlocked Midwesterners.
Yeah, so that's...
You brought that as...
Yeah, I did. It was really an interesting print. Maybe we can get that up. Yeah, there it is. What was it?
Yeah.
Land. I can't.
Landlocked
Yeah.
Midwesterners.
Dad says fish always rot from the head first.
Yeah.
And it was interesting how that was made Munio and I and Renee, we would go fishing a lot on Lake Michigan, and we would catch a lot of salmon. And once he brought back a few salmon, and we ate them, but he kept the skeletal remains of the salmon. And he found zinc plate that was kind of beat up, but he took the remains of the salmon and the oils on the salmon, and put them on the plate, and we put them on in the acid room in the workshop at school, and we let those acids and oils from the salmon, and it almost like X-rayed onto the plate. It oxidized, and once that was done, we cleaned the plates off, and you can see the bones, you can see that oxidation occur, and then he took a dry point needle and he literally drew them in the skeletal remains of the fish, and you can see them through, as I inked them up. This was an earlier state. On the right-hand corner, actually, there are little stars up there, and he drew them more and more, and it actually became the flag of the United States. It was really interesting there. But again, these two salmon, a male and a female, swimming upstream.
Well, unfortunately, it is 6 o'clock, which means that we have to stop. But thank you to all of the panelists for their insights. And if you have not seen the exhibition, please do go. It closes this Sunday. So December 8th is the last day. So please do visit. And thank you very much, Andy, Floyd, and Margo, for your insights.